Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. In ancient Egypt, names were not merely words, they were survival. To speak a name aloud was to call a soul into eternity. To chisel a name into stone was to grant that soul permanence. But to erase a name was a kind of death nobody could escape. You are lying still, listening to the slow wind of time roll across the desert. Imagine yourself beneath the burning sky of the 19th dynasty in a sandstone quarry near Thebes. The dust never settles. Hear it clings to the throat like memory. Workers heave blocks under the sun, their muscles taut, their sandals worn to the leather thread. Among them is not just laborers and overseers, but a scribe, a man not meant to lift stone, but to immortalize those who paid to be remembered. His name has vanished, but what he did survived, somewhere in a forgotten corner of the western Acropolis, on a block that was meant to be part of a nobleman's tomb. The scribe carved a name that should not have been written. It was not a pharaoh's. It was not a priest's. It was a name scratched in haste. In a private corner of polished limestone, with stylus marks that were uneven as if the scribe's hand trembled, not from fatigue, but from fear. We do not know the name he etched, 'cause it was erased. And that is the mystery. You see, ancient Egypt was obsessed with eternity, but it had rules. The damnatio memoria, the deliberate erasure of memory, was a sentence reserved for those who defied the state, the gods, or the delicate harmony of Met. To speak the wrong truth, or to love the wrong person, or to stand in the wrong place, when power shifted, could mean your name would be cut out of every wall it had once graced. This particular stone, unearthed during an unremarkable excavation in 1906, bore strange scars. There was a name once, with every character, each glyph had been meticulously pecked out. Not carelessly, not in anger, but with a craftsman's restraint. It was as if the person doing the erasure knew precisely what each stroke meant, and wanted it to disappear completely, syllable by syllable. Only traces remained, like echoes in dust. Why would a scribe risk death to write a forbidden name? The answer may lie not in what was carved, but in where Egypt's mortuary landscape was, thick with protocol. Every tomb followed patterns. Every inscription had designated places. The gods of the underworld required specific prayers in specific locations. Names were inscribed on sarcophagi, on door lintels, on offering tables, but this name had been hidden on the underside of a cornerstone, one that would have been sealed deep inside the architecture of a funerary chapel. It wasn't meant to be seen, not by the priests, not even by the gods. Only the scribe knew it was there. Perhaps it was a secret memorial. A lover who died disgraced, a brother accused of heresy, a friend who vanished during the religious purges of Akhenaten's fall. Perhaps it was an act of grief so strong that the rules could be bent, but only in silence. The name was there. Sometime later, someone discovered it. The stone had been flipped. Why? In temple building projects, stone reuse was common, especially under later dynasties. Blocks once meant for noblemen's tombs were sometimes absorbed into the foundations of newer chapels. Tombs were dismantled when funds dried up, or when families died out, or when one god replaced another. Workers flipped the stone in there. It was forbidden name, half covered in dirt, but still legible. And just like that, the scribe's act of loyalty, or grief, or defiance was punished. The erasure was surgical and permanent. Who did it? We do not know. Perhaps a new temple priest protecting orthodoxy. Perhaps a government inspector sent to ensure no traces of the heretic king remained. Perhaps another scribe, ordered to unmake the name his colleague had written, but whoever it was, they did not destroy the stone. They hid it again. They rotated it, replaced it into the wall, covered it with plaster and pigment. And for over 3,000 years, the stone kept its silence until one quiet morning. In the dusty light of an early dig, the name reappeared, gone, but not entirely gone. What makes this event remarkable is how unremarkable it seems. It was not a grand temple or a royal tomb. It was not a conspiracy among pharaohs or a battle over gods. It was one scribe, one name, and one quiet choice that became a mystery. And that is often the case with ancient cover-ups. They are not about scale. They are about silence. Taint are about the slow, deliberate work of forgetting. You may wonder why it matters. Why care about one block of stone, about a single vanished name? But imagine this, in a civilization that spent generations writing names to preserve them against time, someone risked everything to remember a name the state wanted forgotten. Someone else erased it, but neither succeeded entirely. The memory flickers, still not in language, but in absence. Who was this name for? What did they do to deserve being remembered in secret? And what kind of grief carves quietly in stone, knowing no one should ever find it? The problem with writing in stone is that it lasts. But in ancient Egypt, even permanence was political. Somewhere near Thebes, beneath layers of earth and forgotten grief, lay a corridor of abandoned tombs. Tombs that were begun but never finished. Others were completed, sealed, and then quietly emptied by those who came after. It was common. Lineages ended. Funds ran out. Priests were reassigned. And sometimes the winds of power changed too swiftly for stone to keep up. The tomb that held the erased name whose fragment was discovered in 1906 was one of these, carved into the rock of a western slope. Its passageways began abruptly and ended nowhere. Chisel marks stopped mid-swing. No sarcophagus ever entered. And on one wall, beneath a faded coat of red ochre paint, were faint outlines of what had once been hieroglyphic directions for a ritual that was never performed. Among archaeologists, this tomb is sometimes called the unsaid chapel. It had no voice, no name, no purpose. Only the stone remained silent and smooth, hiding what had once been carefully planned and then abandoned. This is where the scribe worked. We know more about him than you might expect, not his name, which was never recorded, but his handwriting. Ancient scribes were like calligraphers. Each had their quirks, a looping qa, an uneven ank, a hesitation between determinatives. Scribe appears in a few places across Thebes and Memphis, never famous, but always precise. He worked for more than one noble family, possibly for a local governor, and for at least a short time, he was part of a royal tomb-building crew. And then he disappears from history, except for that one inscription, hidden, etched in haste. It is unlikely he carved the entire tomb himself. Scribes usually worked alongside masons and decorators, inscribing preliminary outlines before pigment and plaster finished the job. His task was to make sure names were spelled correctly, his prayers aligned with theological norms, and all the appropriate deities were present. He carried ink pots, reed brushes, small bits of ochre and coal. It's the power to give a man eternal life or erase it. So why did he break the rule? The answer may rest with the larger silence surrounding that era, because this was not just any period in Egyptian history. This was the generation after Akhenaten, the heretic king, the man who abolished the old gods, who built a new city in the desert, who worshipped one sun disk and discarded the rest. For almost 20 years, Akhenaten turned Egyptian religion inside out. He stripped the temples of Ammon. He closed shrines. He renamed deities. He changed art, poetry, even the grammar of worship. And when he died, deep panic settled over the land. What followed was not just restoration, it was revenge. Priests returned to power. Statues were smashed. Names were scratched out. Deities were razed. Kana, Akhenaten's holy capital, was left to rot. Pharaohs like Tutankhamun and Horemheb ordered systematic erasures of the heretic's memory. Even stone was reused from his temples to build new monuments. It was a great national forgetting, and those who remembered, especially publicly, were punished. If our scribe had once served a patron sympathetic to Akhenaten, he might have found himself suddenly without work, or worse, under suspicion. Any trace of past loyalty could be dangerous. And yet, in this nameless tomb, under a slab not meant to be read, he preserved something. Some scholars believe the name he carved was Akhenaten himself, but that would have been nearly suicidal. More likely, it was someone less visible, a local official, a loyal retainer, a member of the royal household who had fled Thebes during the Counter-Reformation and died far from honor. Someone the scribe had known, perhaps admired, perhaps loved. We will never know what the name said, but the style of the hieroglyphs, measured, deliberate, written in what appears to be new Solar-style script, suggests that whoever it was, their memory still held power for the scribe. He chose not to write it on papyrus, where it would fade, not in paint, where it could be scrubbed, but into the stone, in a place that would be sealed from light, unless someone found it, and someone did. The irony of Egyptian permanence is that nothing stayed still. Temples were built on temples. Cities shifted with the river. Walls were reused. Names were erased and written again. And over centuries, the meaning of a symbol could change. By the time the stone was flipped, perhaps 100 years later, the political landscape had moved on, but fear lingered. Whoever uncovered the name did not report it, did not publish it, did not mention it in temple records or prayer scrolls. Instead, they scraped it out, quietly, carefully, as if they were ashamed not of the person whose name was hidden, but of their own inability to leave it alone. And that tells us something deep about ancient cover dash-ups. They weren't always forced. Sometimes they were chosen, because memory is heavy. To remember someone the state has declared dangerous is to carry their weight, their choices, their consequences. And in a society where even the gods required obedience to order, some chose to forget out of guilt or weariness, or the simple wish to survive. That is why the scribe's act matters. It was small, it was hidden, it was undone, but it was human, a quiet defiance in a world of silence. What else might lie beneath the tombs and temples of Egypt? What other names were hidden, and who risked everything to remember them? There is something strange about an unfinished tomb. It feels like a sentence that was interrupted mid-thought. Most Egyptian tombs hum with a sense of certainty. Even if they were modest or poorly built, they point toward the afterlife with intention. The halls echo with the prayers of priests, the footsteps of mourners, the burn of incense. They were meant to be gateways, not just resting places. Built with time-tested rituals meant to serve a very simple belief that death was not the end, but in the quiet western edge of the necropolis, where the hills shade over narrow wadis and the paths turn to silence. The tomb in question lay undisturbed for centuries. No flowers had ever been left outside. No funerary boats carved into the walls. No signs of visits from family members in the years after burial, because no one had ever been buried there. In all the time since it was cut, not a single body had rested in that tomb. Yet, its walls were prepared, carefully, even reverently. Some parts had been painted, others etched with faint beginnings of familiar scenes, the offering table, the weighing of the heart, the solar bark. But there was no color, no final inscriptions. The names had been left blank or filled in partially, then scratched out again. It was as if someone had started something they were unsure of finishing, and then left before they had to decide. Archaeologists who examined the tomb noted another odd feature. The corridor leading inward had been sealed at a shallow depth, far earlier than it should have been. A blocking wall of rubble and plaster had been built across the entrance hallway, common enough if the tomb was being closed after use, but in this case, there was no burial chamber beyond it, only a dead end. Some believe the tomb was simply abandoned due to budget cuts or political shifts, that during the transition from Akhenaten's radical religious rule back to the traditional priestly system, many projects were paused, reassigned, or deemed heretical. Perhaps the person who commissioned the tomb fell out of favor. Perhaps their money ran out. Perhaps they died in exile, or were never granted a burial at all. But if so, why the seal? Why go through the trouble of building a wall to close something that had never been used? In white, tucked behind one cracked stone panel, was there a strip of linen with ink markings not matching the rest of the tomb. The linen, found in fragments, bore the partial traces of a standard funerary offering formula, but the style was dated to a few decades after the tomb was carved. It was written not by a formal scribe, but someone less practiced. The grammar was irregular. The ink had faded in uneven lines, as if it had been rushed. But one phrase stood out: may he walk among the West, though his name is not remembered. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with names. To speak a name was to make it live again. Erasure of names damnatio memorial was considered one of the worst fates imaginable. It denied a person their afterlife. It stole them from history. And here was someone, generations later, writing a prayer for a man with no name, a man who had been deliberately forgotten. Could this have been a scribe's final offering? A quiet act of memory in a culture built on forgetting? Don't know, but we do know the scribes of Egypt were not just record keepers. They were bridges between the worlds of the living and the dead. Trained in ritual, law, and theology, they carried immense power, especially when it came to funerary practice. A misplaced hieroglyph could curse a soul. An omitted name could doom a family line. Hey, their brushstrokes weren't just calligraphy, they were destiny. That's why the story of the unnamed scribe still echoes. He lived during one of Egypt's most unstable transitions, when pharaohs changed quickly, when temples were looted and rebuilt, when gods were erased and rewritten. And through all of this, the scribes were expected to adjust, to erase when told to rewrite history with a steady hand and no questions. Some surely obeyed, but others, they wrote in margins, on broken pottery shards, inside tombs never meant to be opened. They carved names into the bases of statues, left prayers where only insects and time would find them. It's buried truth beneath ritual, because they understood something deeper than obedience. That memory was not just a duty, it was a resistance. Centuries later, when modern Egyptologists uncovered this tomb and examined its incomplete inscriptions, they didn't find declarations of glory or epic stories of war. They found silence, inconsistencies, hints, a blank name cartouche, a scratch here, a chisel line there, a message not meant to be loud, but not meant to be lost either. The erasure of Akhenaten from official memory was thorough. His name was struck from king lists. His images were destroyed. His city was abandoned. But the fingerprints of his time remained in art, in architecture, in theology, and in the confused tombs of those who came after. Our scribe may not have survived the political reversal, or perhaps he did, quietly, shifting jobs, writing for a local temple, never mentioning the man whose vision once changed the empire. But he left a mark, a name half carved, a prayer on linen, stone sealed not by the state, but by a hand trying to preserve something, or someone. The tomb had no mourners. But it had a witness, and maybe, in the quiet of that unfinished hallway, that's all it ever needed. Because sometimes the most profound acts of remembrance aren't loud monuments or grand funerals, but whispers that defy time, hidden beneath dust, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Who was buried there? No one, but who was remembered? And why was that memory hidden, buried, and sealed in silence? There are cities that die slowly, slipping beneath sand dunes grain by grain, until even their names sound like myths. And then there are cities that vanish all at once, not because of war or fire, not even because of time, but because someone decided it was better if the world forgot they were ever there. Marib was never meant to be forgotten in its prime. It was the jewel of the Arabian Peninsula, carved from dust and ambition, surrounded by endless stretches of sun-burnt desert. And yet, in the middle of all that, nothing, Marib bloomed. Irrigation system alone was an ancient marvel. A dam so wide it turned sand into harvest. A feat of engineering rivaling Rome's aqueducts, built centuries earlier. Water flowed, palms grew, and trade thrived. Spices, incense, myrrh, and frankincense moved along its routes. Caravans packed with cloth and copper and silver stopped to rest here, and on stone tablets, scribes wrote of its markets, its temples, its gods, and its kings. So how could a city that rich, that powerful, simply disappear from the maps? Not just physically, but from memory. Ancient Rome knew of Marib. So did the Greeks. Even India had heard whispers of it. And yet, by the time European cartographers began assembling maps of the Arabian desert in earnest, in the Renaissance and early Enlightenment, Marib was missing. Some 16th century maps simply marked its location with a vague deserta regio. Others offered nothing but blank parchment where once caravans passed, labeling the interior of Arabia as terra incognita, unknown land. Even by the time the French sent expeditions into the region in the 1700s, guided by locals who still told stories of a city swallowed by sand, few believed it had ever truly existed. But it had. And for a very long time, inscriptions from the Sabian kingdom, Marabs, ancient names, survived on temple walls and broken incense burners. The people who lived there were masters of trade, controlling the lucrative incense route that supplied temples and palaces from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Their language, now mostly forgotten, was carved in square scripts, orderly and deliberate. They worshipped a moon god, Almaka, and left behind altars so finely chiseled they outlasted even the names of the kings who built them. And then silence, not gradual. Sudden, the fall of Marib was not a slow decay, as in so many ancient cities. It came, some said, like the cracking of a dam. Literally, the Great Marib Dam, which had turned the desert into a garden, failed. One version of the story says it was sabotage. Another blames a powerful flood. Islamic tradition even linked it to divine punishment. City too rich, too proud, cursed to drown in its own excess. Whatever the cause, when the dam collapsed, the land dried, the fields withered, the trade routes shifted, and the city that had once stood as an oasis of prosperity became a graveyard of ruins. But even ruins should be remembered. Here's where the real mystery begins. In the centuries following Marib's fall, travelers still passed nearby. Some recorded strange, broken walls, old temples, stone lions, fragments of once grand gates. But their notes were often vague, scratched in the margins of journals, passed down as rumor rather than recorded fact. By the 1800s, even the locals had started treating the city as legend. Bedouin tribes spoke of ghost lights at night, of wells that whispered in a language no one spoke anymore, of strange carvings that no one dared translate. And when European archaeologists finally turned their attention to Marib in the 20th century, armed with aerial photography, and translations of Sabian script, they found something even more puzzling. Many of the oldest maps from the region had deliberately omitted it. Not just left it out, but scratched it out. Maps that had been copied and recopied over generations showed faint markings beneath the parchment layers, hidden symbols where Merib's location should have been, curved lines under fresh ink, indentations suggesting roads once marked, then rubbed away. In at least one case, an early map of Arabia housed in a French archive at a cut made clean through a corner where Merib's coordinates would have been. A small surgical removal. Why? Who would do that, eh? And why would someone go to such lengths to pretend a city never existed? The answer might lie in trade. When empires rise, maps become political. Knowledge becomes a weapon. If Merib had once been the heart of the incense trade, and if that trade shifted elsewhere after the dam collapse, then new powers may have had reasons to erase it, to bury its legacy, not just under sand, but under silence. Later Islamic dynasties, struggling to unify a vast and diverse Arabian peninsula, may have sought to simplify the region's past. A city like Merib, with its moon gods, its ancient inscriptions, and its suspiciously powerful priests, was a reminder of a pre-Islamic world, too complex, too independent. Better, perhaps, to call it cursed or mythical. Even early Christian chroniclers seemed unsure how to handle it. Some texts, the Queen of Sheba, the mysterious ruler who visits Solomon's link to Merib, but her name shifts, her origins blur, and the location of her city drifts further into imagination with each retelling. Some say Ethiopia, others say Yemen. Few hint that it was a city destroyed by water and forgotten by time. Still, the ruins remained, silent but stubborn, and when 20th century archaeologists began cataloging them, they found not just fragments of an old city, but of a vanished system. Roads that had no names, canals that led nowhere, broken markers along what must once have been major trade routes that no longer existed in any surviving document. Even the Sabian texts, etched in stone, often used numbers and shorthand that suggested the writers assumed the reader already knew the map. A city so well known, it didn't need directions. So what happens when something that once needed no explanation becomes something no one even asks about? That's how you lose a city. Not with fire, but with forgetfulness. Even today, Merib remains largely unexplored. The dam has been partially rebuilt, some of the temples excavated, but the full city, its houses, its pathways, its people remain buried beneath dust and conflict. And the maps, they remain quiet, just lines, just paper, with too many blank spaces where memory should live. But why were the roads erased? And who benefits when a city is taken off the map, not just physically, but mentally? You are standing at the edge of a forgotten land. There is no sign to greet you, no border to cross, just dry wind, brittle rocks, and an almost imperceptible shift in the color of the soil. But in the 6th century BCE, this would have been the very heart of a network stretching from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf. It wasn't just a city, it was an axis, and someone made sure you wouldn't remember to understand how a city like Merib could be erased. You must first understand who drew the maps in the ancient world and why. Contrary to popular belief, most ancient maps were not designed to help travelers. They were political instruments, symbols of power. When a king or scribe drew a city on a map, it wasn't just to mark its presence. It was to declare its place in the world order. Being named was being known. Being known meant recognition, meant status. Marib had all of these. Once it had embassies. It had treaties. It had traders who wrote contracts on bronze plates. The Sabaeans minted inscriptions with kings' names and God's blessings. and those inscriptions have turned up as far away as southern Mesopotamia. But over time, as empires rose and fell, and new powers redrew the boundaries of civilization, Merib became problematic. It didn't fit. Too wealthy, yet not imperial. Too sophisticated, yet not Greek. Too religious, but in the wrong wit's temples centered on the moon. Its festivals linked to lunar calendars, its priesthood tied to astrology. As monotheism advanced and centralized religions began consolidating power, sites like Merib became uncomfortable reminders of older systems that had no place in the new spiritual order. And so, it began quietly, deliberately, with omissions. In Byzantine texts describing the trade routes through Arabia, Merib is mentioned less and less. The roads that once passed through it are described as if they leap across the desert, skipping its name. Roman maps like the Tabula Pudengarea, though incomplete and centered more on Europe, hint at caravan stops in Arabia, but none precisely where Merib stood. What few mentions do exist are often muddled, named or dismissed as legendarily rich cities or ruins of uncertain origin. But archaeological evidence stone inscriptions, irrigation remnants, temple fragments insist Merib was real. The Great Dam, in particular, remained partially intact for centuries. The fact that it was later repaired during early Islamic periods suggests that at least some administrators knew what lay beneath the surface. Still, it was never fully reclaimed, never rebuilt as a center of commerce or faith. One reason might be found in an early Islamic tradition called al-Qisos, or moral histories. In these stories, cities that had once defied divine lore, grown too wealthy for their own good, were cast as warnings. They were not to be studied or honored, but forgotten. Quran itself references a people of the dam who were scattered after ignoring divine guidance. While never named directly, many scholars link this to Merib. If a city could be framed as a cautionary tale, then its ruins were best left buried, its records best untranscribed, its name best unspoken. And so, the hands that copied the maps, the scribes, the monks, the geographers, learned to skip it, not because of ignorance, but because of consensus, a quiet agreement that what once was should now remain undone. This practice was not unique to Arabia. Throughout history, erasure has been a tool of power. When a Roman emperor fell from favor, his name was scratched off monuments damnatio memoria, they called it. In ancient China, books were burned and entire dynasties rewritten depending on who held the pen. Even in more recent European history, cities destroyed in wars were sometimes omitted from official atlases for decades, as if non-existence could protect national pride. But Merib was different. It was not an enemy city. It was not rebellious or scandalous or occupied by foreign rulers. It was, by all accounts, a functional, peaceful trade capital with a sophisticated bureaucracy and one of the most advanced water management systems in the pre-modern world. That made it dangerous not to armies, but to narratives. For if Merib thrived without the empires that later claimed the desert, then it stood as proof that civilization did not need Rome or Mecca or Constantinople to bloom. It challenged the idea that history moved in one clean line, from chaos to order, from paganism to faith, from dust to enlightenment. Merib was a curve, a fork in the road that was paved over, and so it was made to vanish. One might ask, why weren't its ruins uncovered earlier? The answer lies in geography, politics, and silence. Geographically, Merib sits in what is now northern Yemen, an area long plagued by instability. Colonial-era archaeologists largely avoided it due to tribal conflicts, inhospitable climate, and lack of direct imperial interest. Unlike Egypt's pyramids or Iraq's ziggurats, Merib's ruins were never incorporated into national myths that attracted European funding. Politically, Yemen's fragmentation meant that few long-term preservation projects took root. The early 20th century saw scattered efforts to document Sabaean inscriptions, but many were lost or sold to private collectors. A handful were smuggled into European museums, often mislabeled. And then, of course, there was silence. Modern cartographers had little incentive to correct the ancient maps. Marib, when mentioned at all, was often considered a minor footnote, overshadowed by Petra, Palmyra, or Damascus. Even today, satellite imagery reveals more about the extent of the city than any museum display. Subtle ridges, buried walls, outlines, a vanished road still visible from space, though covered by centuries of neglect. And if you listen to the local guides, they'll tell you about wells that never dry, despite no visible source, stones that hum when touched at night, footpaths worn smooth that lead nowhere. Superstitions, they say, or maybe something else. One archaeologist, in a quiet interview in the 1980s, once described Marib as a place that wanted to be forgotten. But cities do not want, people do. And so the question returns, who decided this? Was it a council of religious scribes? A generation of traders who profited more from new routes? Or perhaps it was no one at all. Perhaps it was simply easier, over time, to forget what didn't fit, to draw cleaner maps, to leave blank spaces where truth once lived. But truth does not stay buried forever. Even now, with renewed interest in ancient Arabia and the support of international research teams, Marib is beginning to reclaim its place. Excavations continue. Inscriptions are being translated. Artifacts reassembled. Some are calling it a rediscovery. But the truth is it was always there. Waiting, dust settles, ink fades, but stone remembers. Still, the maps tell a quieter story. A tale of absence. A puzzle of borders redrawn and histories erased. But can a city truly return if no one ever sees it again as it was? As the 21st century arrived, the winds still blew across the broken walls of Marib. Children played near the cracked foundations of what were once temples. Locals passed by ancient columns without stopping, as though they were simply large stones, weathered by time, nothing more. Tourists came rarely, and scholars even more rarely, but the stones waited. They always do. The silence around Rebbe had lasted so long that even modern governments had come to treat it as background, a place known, but unexplored, existing on the edge of collective memory. For a time, the only things that seemed to remember the city's full shape were the satellite cameras drifting high above the earth. From above, could see the lines that shouldn't be there, faint outlines of once straight roads running in parallel through what now looked like empty dust. Curved arcs in the ground where watchtowers once stood, the shadowy imprint of square structures, courtyards, warehouses, perhaps even open-air markets. The dam itself, partially rebuilt in the 1980s, stood out starkly against the natural hills. But what truly captivated archaeologists were the dry channels branching from it like veins. These were not chaotic, they were deliberate, an ancient, forgotten order. And yet the old maps had left these patterns out. Or worse, had drawn them differently. In some cases, explorers from the 18th and 19th centuries sketched the land around Marib with intentional distortions, placing rivers where there were none, or marking cities that had never existed, while leaving Marib unmentioned just miles away. Why would anyone go to the trouble? Because cartography was rarely neutral. In colonial times, maps became political tools, not just navigational aids. Marking a place on a map wasn't about discovery, it was about claiming. If Marib, with its dam and temple ruins and inscriptions, proved that the ancient Arabian Peninsula had once thrived independently of Roman, Persian, or Islamic empires, then that fact complicated the neat stories empires wanted to tell, especially when modern geopolitical ambitions ran directly through those same sands. Marib had to remain uncertain. Better to be rumored than real. Better to be myth than memory. But slowly, piece by piece. The ruins began to speak. A joint expedition in the early 1990s uncovered not just carvings and foundations, but a full archive of stone inscriptions buried beneath collapsed rooms. These weren't sacred texts or royal proclamations. They were boring, and in that boringness, there were revolutionary shopping lists, tax records, wages paid to dam workers, an inventory of imported incense resins by weight and place of origin, names of women who inherited land, contracts for transporting goods across caravan stations, a dispute between a stonemason and a local merchant about cracked marble columns. This was no myth. This was a city, a working city, with rules and paperwork and petty arguments. It's the kind of place where people lived, not just where legends happened. And as more of these inscriptions were translated, a clearer picture formed. Marib had been a node, a logistical center, a cultural hinge between Africa, Arabia, and Asia, and yet, unlike Petra or Babylon, never got the glory. One reason may be visual. Petra is cut into cliffs. Babylon had massive gates and walls, while Marib, though once large, was built of mud brick and dry masonry materials that fade. Its buildings weren't carved for eternity. They were practical, even replaceable. Temples stood for centuries, but homes were knocked down and rebuilt. Over time, the desert erased what the dam collapse didn't. But that isn't the full story. Even today, Marib makes the news. It's not because of archaeology, it's because of war. The region has remained politically fragile for decades. And like so many archaeological sites in conflict zones, Marib is at risk, not just of being forgotten, but of being lost again. Some parts of the ancient city have already been damaged by military activity, looting, and uncontrolled development. The same structures that waited thousands of years to be remembered now teeter on the edge of being erased a second time. The irony is bitter in trying to forget Marib. History buried its memory in trying to rediscover it. Modernity may destroy its remains, but even if the stones fall, the records now live elsewhere, digitized, photographed, shared. Some are being reconstructed in 3D models. Others are studied by university students continents away. The ghosts of Marib are whispering in academic journals now, in museums, in textbooks. Still, the question lingers like a stubborn layer of desert dust. Why was it erased in the first place? Theories abound. Some say it was about trade that newer empires wanted to obscure older trade, cubs, to justify their own roots. Others argue it was theological, that erasing a pre-monotheistic city allowed later religious movements to simplify their narrative of history. Still others suggest political expediency. Forgotten city is easier to govern than a remembered one, especially in a place where historical pride might inspire regional autonomy. And yet, there is another theory. Perhaps Marib's disappearance wasn't the result of conspiracy, but of convenience. Maybe it didn't take much, just a few cartographers choosing not to mention it, a few chroniclers skipping its name, a few centuries of silence, and then, 1,000 years later, the world forgets to remember. But the city remembers. The dam's channels, though dry, still snake across the desert floor. The inscriptions, though chipped, still hold meaning. Can the maps, once scrubbed clean, now hold outlines invisible to the naked eye, but traceable with light and patience? It is as if the land itself refused to forget. So what does it mean for us now to uncover a forgotten city? Not just in physical terms, but emotionally. What do we do with the knowledge that something this complex, this rich, was hidden not by time or accident, but by choice? Do we apologize? Do we revise the textbooks, or do we simply add it back to the maps and pretend we always knew? In many ways, Marib is still missing, not because we can't find it, but because we still don't know what to do with it. It complicates the neat story of civilizational progress. It asks uncomfortable questions about what else we've chosen to forget. What other ruins lie under our assumptions, hidden in plain sight? The next time you look at a map, pause at the empty places, not just the deserts and forests and oceans, but the spaces where names used to be. The spaces where someone decided silence was easier than truth. Marab's stones will one day crumble, but its memory, once erased, now lingers like a watermark behind history's ink. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of all. The city wasn't lost. We were. And now, slowly, we are finding our way back. When you lie awake beneath the hush of the evening sky, and the air grows still as parchment rolled tight against the passing of hours. There's a quiet rhythm in the silence of space where stories once lived but were deliberately erased. Not lost by accident, not swallowed by time, but removed, name by name, word by word, line by line. And few silences were as vast or as intentional as the one that fell over China in the 3rd century BCE. It begins with a man not fond of being challenged, Qin Shi Huang. The first emperor of China was not a man easily swayed. He was the unifier of the fractured warring states, the builder of walls that would one day become great, and a ruler whose vision for order was so severe it carved his name into every inch of the country. He feared one thing above all: disagreement. To disagree was to create division. To remember another way of living was to risk unraveling everything he had stitched into place. So he built more than walls. He built silence. But silence doesn't start loud. It starts small. A suggestion, a rule, a consequence. In the court of Qin Shi Huang, silence began with the scrolls. The scrolls in question weren't prophecies or sacred chants. They were mundane. They were historical treatises, philosophical writings, records of thought. China, at the time, was not devoid of intellectual life. Quite the opposite. Before the Qin rose, it had been a place of ideas, of what scholars now call the 100 schools of thought. These weren't mere opinions tossed into the wind. These were deep, rich rivers of argument and counter-argument. Confucians wrote of virtue and filial duty. Legalists argued for strict law and harsh penalties. Taoists praised balance, the uncarved block, the flow of nature without interference. Mohists prized logic and universal love. There were strategists, logicians, mystics, some practical, some poetic, some maddeningly abstract, and all of them, to a ruler trying to hold power, were inconvenient. Qin Shi Huang preferred certainty. He had, after all, risked everything to bring the warring states under one banner. Ain't that banner didn't have room for wandering thoughts or public debates about what ought to be. It needed discipline, harmony, uniformity, not a tapestry of traditions, but a stone path laid in a straight line, one stone after another, every edge sharp and aligned. So he gave his chancellor, a man named Li Si, a task, and Li Si, loyal and brilliant, obeyed. In 213 BCE, he issued the decree: all non-legalist texts would be burned. History books, philosophical dialogues, poetic ramblings, all consigned to fire if they did not align with the emperor's vision. Private libraries were scoured. Scholars who resisted were arrested. Some were executed. Others simply disappeared. It wasn't just the books. It was the people who read them, the people who remembered them. The burnings weren't chaotic. They were bureaucratic, organized, timetabled. The fires were fed by titles and categories, not superstition, but administration. One by one, scrolls turned to ash. Bamboo slats split and curled under heat. Silk pages blackened, then vanished. And where there had once been debate, there was now doctrine. It's easy to imagine this as a flash of destruction, but in truth, it was a slow silence, the kind that spreads not in smoke, but in hesitation. When a teacher no longer quotes Confucius for fear of a listener reporting them, when a child grows up never hearing the name Laozi, when a family hesitates before passing a hand-copied essay down to the next generation, unsure if it's safer to burn it first. That's how silence deepens, not through violence, but through the quiet decision not to speak. Yet, not everything was lost. Some scrolls survived hidden in walls, buried in graves, whispered across regions that had not yet fully bent to Qin control, and some fragments resurfaced centuries later during the Han Dynasty, but the damage had already been done. A rupture had occurred. There's something peculiar about burning ideas. You can't be sure what's gone. Kia, you only know what remains. It's like trying to understand a forest by looking at the ashes of a single tree. And so, modern scholars often ask, what was burned exactly? We don't know. That's the horror of it. We know that the Confucian texts were a target, that books of historical comparison texts that held up past rulers as examples were deemed dangerous, that alternative cosmologies and moral arguments were considered destabilizing. But beyond that, the full catalog is lost. There may have been schools of thought we'll never even name. Thinkers whose ideas vanished completely, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. And in their absence, the legalist doctrine became dominant. Legalism, in this context, was not about legality in the modern sense. It was a philosophy of control. People, it argued, were selfish and short-sighted. Order must be imposed from above. The law should be harsh, universal, and without exception. Reward and punishment were tools, not of fairness, but of stability. For Chen Shi Huang, this was the way to rule a vast land. Uniform weights and measures, uniform script, uniform punishments, and uniform thought. He did not merely burn books. He rewrote reality. Even time was standardized. Calendars, once local and cyclical, were reformatted. The past, once rich with competing interpretations, was now streamlined. The state would decide what history meant, what the people should know, what they should forget. And still, the emperor was not satisfied. In 212 BCE, a year after the book burnings, a new order was issued. One more brutal dot. Over 400 scholars were buried alive. Why? Some say it was because they continued to argue with the imperial court. Others suggest they had knowledge the emperor feared. Perhaps it was simply a warning or demonstration of what silence now looked like. We can't know the details, but we do know this. When the first scroll was burned, a line was crossed. When the first scholar was buried, that silence became law. Yet, even silence leaves echoes in the centuries that followed. The Han Dynasty reversed many Qin policies. They restored some Confucian texts, celebrated scholars once more, declared the Qin to have been too harsh. And yet even then the loss was felt. Whole schools of thought had been disrupted. Whole generations had grown up without access to certain voices. Now the scholars who returned did so carefully, aware of how fragile memory had become. It makes you wonder how much of what we think we know about ancient China is only the part that survived. How many ideas vanished in those fires, never to be resurrected. When we say the Chinese believed this, or the ancients practiced that, we are often speaking through the narrow window left behind after someone shut all the other doors. The scrolls were burned, the questions were silenced, and the cost wasn't just intellectual, it was human. People lived entire lives inside smaller thoughts. People taught narrower truths. People remembered less, all because one man believed unity required silence. Silence. the deeper you walk into the silence that followed the burning of the scrolls, the more the stillness becomes a landscape of its own. It wasn't empty, structured, measured, and maintained with a kind of precision only a government obsessed with control could achieve. To understand how forgetting became official, you have to understand the Qin bureaucracy. This was not a kingdom run by intuition or charm. Chen Shuhuang's administration was the most mechanized, document-driven, impersonal engine of rule the ancient world had seen. Every province had its function, every official his ledger, and every citizen his place. The emperor was not simply a ruler, he was an architect of order. After the book burnings of 213 BCE, the next challenge was not merely to destroy the old texts, but to build a new canon in their place. Its vacuum had to be filled with something, and that something was legalist orthodoxy, written and rewritten into every school, court, and law book across the empire. The Ministry of Rites, usually tasked in previous dynasties with preserving tradition and ritual, was restructured. Its scholars were no longer scholars in the old sense. They were managers of approved knowledge. Copyists worked under supervision. Lessons were read aloud from newly standardized texts that promoted obedience, hierarchy, and absolute state authority. Even calligraphy was monitored, as the Qin script was introduced and mandated across the empire. The script itself, the unification of regional writing systems, was praised as a civilizing force. But it also had another consequence. It made older texts harder to access, even if they were preserved. A scroll in an archaic dialect or a local variation of script could not be easily copied or understood. And so knowledge, once shared in many tongues, began to narrow. It was a quiet, incremental process. Not a bonfire, but a slow turning of keys. Sometimes forgetting looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. You can imagine the scribes seated in rows, the kit, their brushes dipped in black ink, copying not poems or histories, but stay-tissued maxims. The people must not be trusted with interpretation. The ruler sees what they cannot. The law is the only teacher, scroll after scroll, line after line. Not because these phrases were beautiful, but because they were safe. In some districts, confiscation lists were drawn up. Officials were told to search temples, estates, and even burial chambers for unapproved texts. In others, landowners were required to sign declarations affirming they had no copies of forbidden writings. Witnesses were expected to report violations. Punishment was steep, often exile, imprisonment, or death. And yet, resistance flickered, here and there, in the shadows. A few scholars buried books beneath floorboards or behind false walls. Others copied entire works from memory, hoping to preserve them for the future. In one legend, a village teacher tattooed the Analects of Confucius onto his own skin to keep it from being lost. There's no proof the story is true. But the fact that it exists tells us something, that people knew what was being erased, and they mourned it. The Qin dynasty, for all its power, was short-lived. It's only 15 years, but the memory of its silencing endured for centuries. Later, dynasties would look back and name this act not just a policy, but a catastrophe of the mind. They called it the Fanshu Kanjiar, the burning of books and the burying of scholars, a phrase that chills in its simplicity. Not the burning of cities, not the killing of armies, but of books. Books even the Han, who followed the Qin and restored many banned ideas, struggled to recover what had been lost. Reconstructing Confucian texts became a generational effort. Different versions were found in old tombs, carved into stone, passed orally from elder to student. But the variations were confusing. Whole chapters had gone missing. Names had changed. Chronologies no longer matched. Scholars debated not just ideas, but which versions of the ideas were real. In this way, forgetting ripples outward. The state doesn't just remove content, It unmoors memory. What came before becomes fuzzy, debatable, uncertain. And in that uncertainty, the state inserts itself as the final source of truth. Perhaps that was the point all along. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE on a tour of his empire. He believed, some say, that he would live forever. He sought immortality through elixirs, rituals, and hidden tombs. But his death was kept secret for weeks. His officials, terrified of instability, transported his body in a cart surrounded by fish to mask the smell of decay. Even in death, the machinery of control continued. But the dynasty did not last. Rebellion surged. The Qin fell, and a new order rose. Yet the question remains, what survived the fire? We know that legalism continued subtly in Chinese administration for millennia. The harsh structure of the Qin, though officially denounced, echoed through the corridors of later imperial rule. Democracy remained strong. Uniformity was valued, and the memory of how quickly dissent could be erased lingered in every hesitant brushstroke of a scholar's calligraphy. In a strange twist, the silence of the Qin gave way to the canon of the Han, which celebrated Confucianism not as a wild forest of thought, but as a cultivated garden of fixed texts and accepted wisdom. What had once been plural became singular. What had been debate became doctrine. The scrolls returned, but changed. It makes one wonder, is restoration ever complete? When knowledge is lost, then remembered, then reapproved, does it come back the same? What about the ideas that no one copied? The voices no one thought to preserve? The philosophies that were never rewritten because they had only lived briefly in fragile ink or quiet conversations? There is something haunting in this, that the most dangerous thing to a ruler is not an army or a rebellion, but a question that invites people to think for themselves. And perhaps that's why the Qin tried to destroy the very habit of asking. But questions are persistent. They hide in stories, in lullabies, in proverbs and parables, They curl themselves into grammar and grow like ivy around silence. Even after the fires, even after the ash, someone still asked, why were the scrolls burned? And that question in itself is a survival. By the time the Qin dynasty collapsed, many of its roads were still uncracked, its coins still circulating, its walls still standing, but its silences had already begun to spread. It's easy, centuries later, to speak of the burning of books as a moment, as if history moves in snapshots. But the true weight of this event wasn't measured in fire. It was measured in what never came back. Some texts would be partially reconstructed during the Han dynasty. Others were found centuries later, pieced together from stone carvings or bamboo fragments stored in hidden tombs. But most were never seen again. They exist only as names mentioned in other books' titles without content. Their ideas is gone, and so we're left with a peculiar kind of historical shadow. You may hear scholars speak of the Shangshu, the Dazhuan, or the Guliang Zhuan. These were supposed to be commentary works, part of the Confucian canon. But the copies we have today aren't necessarily the originals. They are reconstructions based on memory, oral tradition, and the guesses of later dynasties. When Han scholars tried to rebuild the past, they debated endlessly. Was this phrase correct? Had this passage been altered under Qin censorship? Sometimes two versions of the same text emerged, each slightly different, each claiming to be authentic. This is what happens when a state tries to delete thought. Even the recovery becomes uncertain. Later, emperors tried to learn from the Qin. Some embraced Confucianism more overtly. Others were subtler in their control, but the template had been set. Burning wasn't always necessary. Once you show that ideas can be erased, fear does most of the work. Censorship becomes a reflex. Self-censorship becomes a survival skill. What does it mean for a civilization to forget its own thoughts? That question lingered into the Song dynasty over 1,000 years after the Qin scrolls turned to ash. Song scholars like Sima, Guang, and Zhu, she attempted to rebuild a true moral order using layers of historical analysis and revision. They weren't just writing history. They were trying to stitch memory back together. But they, too, relied on whatever scraps had survived, and always, in the back of their minds, what else was once known. What wisdom, or warning, or foolishness was lost forever. In a world where paper was precious and knowledge lived in fragile mediums, the destruction of even a few scrolls had enormous consequence. Imagine if Aristotle's works had been burned in Athens, or if no one had copied the Egyptian Book of the Dead. That's what happened here not once, okay, but across an entire empire. The Qin's act wasn't unique in world history. The Library of Alexandria burned, whether by accident or decree. The Maya codices were destroyed by Spanish missionaries. In Europe, book burnings followed wars of religion and empire. But the Qin were distinct in their methodical silence. They didn't burn books to fight a religion. They burned them to build a government. What was lost? Perhaps some strange synthesis of Tao and law. Perhaps a theory of leadership rooted in empathy. Perhaps a poem so beautiful it would have changed the way we speak. We will never know. And yet, not everything disappeared in the northern provinces. Far from the reach of Qin commanderies, teachers passed knowledge in whispers. Grandfathers taught grandchildren proverbs. Hermits in the mountains composed thoughts that borrowed old rhythms. Some lines survived not because they were permitted, but because they were loved. And love, unlike decree, doesn't need approval. After the Han dynasty stabilized, it encouraged scholars to gather all that could be recovered. The Confucian classics were carved into stone so they could not be burned again. Students copied them onto scrolls. Commentaries blossomed. Schools of interpretation arose. Old text versus new text. Was this version the pre-Qin original or the Han revision? People debated ink like others debate scripture, and still gaps remained. It is those gaps that remind us that even civilizations as vast and brilliant as ancient China can forget themselves. They can choose to forget or be forced to. They can choose order over memory, and then find that order costs them the very ideas that once made them rich in thought. This matters because forgetting doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's the teacher who no longer teaches a certain chapter. Sometimes it's the library that files a book in the wrong place and never looked for it again. Sometimes it's the scroll that nobody bothers to copy because it doesn't fit the moment. And so, when you read the sayings of Confucius, or the strategies of Sun Tzu, or the political theories of Han Fizi, remember that what survived was filtered not only by time, but by fire. Even today, the story of the Qin burnings is debated in China. Some see it as exaggerated by later dynasties to discredit the Qin. Others insist it was as comprehensive as the records say. But whether the number was 400 books or 4,000, the principle remains chillingly clear. A single ruler, fearing the power of questions, chose to answer them with flames, and for generations afterward. Even as the ashes settled, people learned to whisper instead of wonder. That's the legacy of the burned scroll. Not just what was lost, but what was never allowed to grow. We often talk about knowledge as power, but perhaps it is more accurate to say that questions are dangerous. Books, after all, do not rebel on their own. It is the reader, the child, the farmer, the advisor who, upon reading, asks. And what the Qin destroyed was not merely parchment. They tried to destroy the habit of inquiry, but questions return. They always do. They return in the form of curiosity. They return in the face of confusion. They return in the night when someone sits beside a candle and wonders, quietly, what did they not want me to know? In that quiet moment is where the scroll begins again. At the edge of the ancient city of Babylon, under the long shadows of the Mesopotamian dusk, there once stood a gate so grand that even the wind slowed near it. The Ishtar gate, named for the goddess of love and war, was tiled in deep blue, glazed brick, its surface rippling with lions and bulls and dragons, each marching forward in silent procession. But this gate, dazzling as it was merely an opening into something even larger, a city walled with secrets, a city where bricks told stories, over time were quietly erased. You walk along the ruins today, and you won't find many bricks bearing names, at least not anymore. What once lined Babylon's avenues, layer upon layer of clay tablets pressed into the walls, stamped with declarations of kingship and conquest, are now scattered, or missing, or replaced. And so, to understand what was lost, you must first understand the strange relationship that ancient Mesopotamian rulers had with bricks. In Mesopotamia, bricks were not just construction material, they were records. Each baked brick, sun-dried and kiln-fired, often carried the name sometimes of the king who ordered its placement, sometimes the god it honored. These weren't random or decorative. They were declarations of legitimacy. To stamp your name on a brick was to leave proof. I built this. I was here. I ruled. Nebuchadnezzar II, the king most associated with Babylon's golden age in the 6th century BCE, understood this better than anyone. He stamped his name on tens of thousands of bricks. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the restorer of the temples Esagila and Azida. Many of them read. Each brick, laid one atop the other, was a line of text in a wall-sized poem about power. But not all bricks told the same story. That's where the mystery begins. Some bricks were unstamped. Some had different names, Volder kings, rival dynasties, strange symbols. And then, later still, some bricks disappeared altogether, reused in later construction, ground down for new materials, taken away. Babylon, you see, was not only a city that rose, it was a city that was recycled. And with every reuse, a little memory was scrubbed away. By the time the Persian Empire conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, the city had already begun to fade. But it was not simply war that dimmed its walls. It was something quieter, dismantling. Slowly, over generations, bricks from Babylon's sacred precincts were hauled off to build other cities, to strengthen fortresses, or simply to clear space. Alexander the Great visited Babylon not long before his death. He is said to have admired the city, even planning to make it his capital. But after his death, his generals fought over his empire, and Babylon fell further into ruin. Temples collapsed, canals dried, and walls, those grand speaking walls, were pulled apart, brick, memory by memory. But even ruins can whisper. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, European archaeologists began digging deep into the soil of Iraq. They found layers of bricks, some still stamped with names. Strangely, they also found gap sections, where bricks were clearly removed. Entire segments where inscriptions should have been, but weren't. Some walls had names chiseled out. Others had bricks replaced with plain, anonymous ones. And some stamped bricks appeared in unexpected places, outside their original context, mixed in with later repairs. What had happened? Was this simple reuse? Or was something more deliberate at play? Some scholars believe that later rulers, especially under the Seleucid and Parthian eras, may have sought to erase the memory of earlier kings. By removing their names from public structures, they rewrote the city's lineage. Others think that as bricks were stolen or sold, collectors or merchants selectively took the ones with markings, seeing them as valuable. Still others believe religious shifts played a role, that inscriptions to forgotten gods were purposefully destroyed. But the most chilling possibility is also the most mundane, that people needing shelter took what they could, and in doing so, erased history without meaning to. Imagine a family in the 3rd century BCE salvaging bricks from a crumbling ziggurat to build a hearth. They don't care whose name is etched there. They need warmth. They need food. The king's declaration, so carefully pressed into wet clay centuries earlier, becomes just another surface blackened by smoke. And yet, some bricks survived in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. The reconstructed Ishtar Gate towers over visitors. Its lions still walk. Its blue still glows. And its bricks' many originals still bear the name of Nebuchadnezzar. But this preservation came at a cost. The gate was removed from Iraq during the early 1900s, under terms that would now be questioned by archaeologists and governments alike. What remains in Babylon today is a ghost of the original replica built by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, who, echoing ancient kings, stamped many of the new bricks with his name. And so the cycle continues. Every ruler wants to be remembered, but remembrance is not a promise. It is a negotiation with time, with politics, with erosion. The bricks of Babylon show us that even those who stamp their names deep into the earth can be forgotten or replaced, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by accident, but always, eventually. Even today, fragments of Babylon's walls appear in unexpected places, museum storerooms, private collections, sometimes even on the black market. Each time a brick is moved, its context is lost. It becomes an object, not a sentence. And the wall that once spoke becomes, once again, silent. So, what did the walls say? We may never fully know. And perhaps the more important question is, why were we meant to forget? You walk now not through Babylon as it was, but through what remains of it. A low field of mud brick outlines, some cracked courtyards, scattered walls that seem to sink a little more into the earth with every passing year. There's a gentle wind, and somewhere far off, a rustle of dry reeds by the Euphrates. The city that once held the world's gaze has become a quiet ghostless, a ruin and more, a suggestion. But here and there, dust still stirs with something older, something that once declared itself aloud. There are bricks, some stamped, some rubbed smooth by time. You crouch and look closely. The cuneiform is shallow now, worn almost flat in places. But it is there, a king's name, a god's title. Ritual phrase repeated again and again. It reads like a whisper, and you wonder not who carved it, but who saw it disappear. Because the mystery of Babylon's missing bricks isn't just about loss. It's about replacement. It's about intentional rearrangement. The act of pulling out one truth and placing another in its place. That idea that history is not, it's forgotten, but overwritten's central to what happened here. It begins quietly during the long twilight after Babylon's golden age. After the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, control shifted. The Persians came, then the Greeks, then the Parthians. Each new ruler inherited a city full of symbols, names, gods, architectural, of which pointed to someone else's authority. And each ruler had a choice: preserve those names or erase them. For the Persians, especially under Cyrus the Great and Darius, the approach was strategic. They presented themselves not as destroyers, but as restorers. Cyrus famously allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. He even funded temple restorations. But he did not restore all temples, and not all names remained. In Babylon, Persian control meant the redirection of resources. Temples, not directly useful to the imperial agenda, were left to decay. Priests, who had once recorded every star in sacrifice, found themselves without patrons. And walls, those elaborate cuneiform-covered surfaces, were no longer maintained. They cracked. They were looted. They were repurposed. Then came Alexander. His arrival in 331 BCE was marked not by conquest, but by reverence. He saw Babylon as a prize, a place of history and wisdom. He ordered restoration projects. He planned to rebuild temples, to elevate Babylon as the capital of his new empire. But Alexander died suddenly in 323 BCE, likely of fever, and his plans collapsed with him. What followed was not restoration, but division. His generals called the Diadochi fought over the empire. Babylon, caught in the struggle, became a site of extraction. Its materials were stripped for other cities, Seleucia on the Tigris, for instance, built nearby with bricks from Babylon's ziggurats and walls. And again, the names disappeared. Not only were inscribed bricks removed, but new ones were made blank, or bearing the names of new rulers. The new cities had their own walls, their own stories. Babylon became a quarry, not a capital. And in this, something profound happened. Babylon's voice was fractured. The city had once spoken in a unified way, its bricks echoing the same names, the same gods, the same myths. Now, its fragments traveled in silence. One brick in a temple foundation, one in a village oven, one under a road. Imagine a traveler, centuries later say, in the 2nd century BC, he finding a stamped brick on the road to Seleucia. He turns it over. He sees the name Nebuchadnezzar. But who is that now? Just another dead king. The context is gone. The wall is gone. The voice is gone. And still, the process continued. The Parthians, and later the Sasanians, built over Babylon. They left few records about the city's past. To them, Babylon was not sacred. It was convenient. Its materials were useful, its temples irrelevant, and stories increasingly opaque. By the time Islamic scholars wrote about Babylon in the 9th and 10th centuries CE, it was already more legend than fact. They spoke of towers and idols, of Nimrod and prophets, but the bricks, the stamped names, the precise details, they were already buried, forgotten, yet not entirely gone, because even as the bricks faded, left clues in other places. Medieval travelers to the region reported strange mounds filled with old writing. European visitors in the 17th and 18th centuries took note of the patterns. The British Museum began collecting samples. In the 1800s, German archaeologists under Robert Koldewey undertook systematic excavations. They found not just the Ishtar Gate, but entire courtyards of stamped bricks. Some bore names previously lost to history: Nebuchadnezzar, Nabopolassar, Nabonidus, and with them, questions. Why were some names repeated endlessly, while others appeared only once? Why were some bricks clustered in certain layers, then abruptly stopped? Why were bricks with royal inscriptions found in foundations, hidden, unseen? One theory: ritual placement. That some bricks were not meant to be seen, but to be buried as offerings, calling upon the gods to bless the structure. Another theory: censorship. That rival rulers in later periods buried or obscured older names to assert their own dominance. And still another: accidental preservation. That some layers of stamped bricks survived simply because they were out of reach, too deep, too damaged, too forgotten. Whatever the reason, the result is the same: a puzzle, a language partially preserved, partially lost, and with it, a story that never quite finishes. What did Babylon's walls say? They said, "This city was mighty. The Nebuchadnezzar made this for the gods. This temple stands because of me." But they also said other things, things we no longer understand. Some bricks were stamped not with royal declarations, but with strange phrases, lists of materials, names of workers, invocations to minor deities. These bricks tell of the people who actually built the city: the craftsmen, the laborers, scribes. Most of those bricks are missing. They were the first to go, considered least valuable by collectors. least important by later builders. And yet, they may have held the deepest truths about how Babylon was made, about who made it, about what it meant to live beneath those grand walls. Now, its bricks are mostly gone, and so we walk through ruins, listening for echoes, tracing shapes in sun-baked earth, reading fragments, and always asking, who chose which bricks to save? Who chose which to forget? And what do those choices say about us? Perhaps history, like a wall, is only as strong as the bricks we leave behind. But if the names fade, what then holds the wall together? Now, imagine the bricks scattered. Some lie face down in the dust where a Babylonian priest once walked. Their inscriptions never again touched by our reader's eyes. Others are sealed into the foundations of villages far from the Euphrates, repurposed as steps, thresholds, or hearths. Some made their way to museums, boxed and labeled, viewed through glass with little of their original voice intact. And then there is the wall itself. The great outer wall of Babylon once, stretching dozens of miles, once so wide that chariots could race side by side across its top. Today, that wall no longer stands, not because time wore it away slowly, like wind hollowing stone, but because it was disassembled. Purpose. The decision not to rebuild Babylon says as much about the world as the bricks once did. After Alexander's death and the fragmentation of his empire, Babylon lost not just its political relevance, but its symbolic weight. Quote, once the axis mundi, the center of the world, it became inconvenient, outdated. Its temples belonged to gods no longer worshipped. Its architecture served rituals no longer practiced. It became, in the eyes of successive empires, a ruin, waiting. By the 1st century CE, Roman authors wrote of Babylon as a place already abandoned, its gardens gone to dust, its palaces stripped of beauty. Pliny the Elder described the city in his Natural History as a desert. Others confused Babylon with Nineveh, or conflated its ruins with biblical prophecies. Its identity was slipping even from memory. Yet the silence of the wall is not the same as absence, because even as the bricks disappeared, their influence endured. Let's follow one idea, the stamped brick, to the centuries that came after. The idea of marking stone with text wasn't unique to Babylon, but the Babylonians perfected it. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, every major building included thousands of bricks impressed with a signature cuneiform stamp. It was both a boast and a legacy, a way of tying the structure to the king's name eternally. Later, empires copied the practice. The Achaemenids in Persia did it. The Greeks inscribed foundations. The Romans engraved milestones, triumphal arches, Kievan aqueducts. It's a threaded line of influence running quietly through the ancient world. But in Babylon, the thread was cut. No one rebuilt the wall. No one restamped the bricks. Instead, something stranger happened. The wall was remembered, not for its presence, but for its vanishing. Consider this. When German archaeologists excavated Babylon in the early 20th century, they found whole sections of the wall base with bricks still inscribed in cuneiform, but the top half was gone, stripped clean, like a peeled orange. Above the waist of the wall, nothing but empty space and wind-blown dust. Where did those bricks go? Some ended up in Baghdad, others in local towns. But most, it seems, were taken in earlier centuries' reuse for mosques, roads, and homes across the region. This recycling was practical, but it was also quiet. No monument was raised to explain that a Babylonian wall was being dismantled to make way for a village bakery. No ceremony marked the final stone pulled from the ziggurat side. It just happened, piece by piece, until one day the wall was simply no longer there, and in its place only questions remained. Was it better that the wall vanished, leaving its story to the imagination? Or should it have been preserved, like the pyramids or the Parthenon, visible and proud? Even today, there is no clear answer. In the early 2000s, during attempts to restore the site for tourism, authorities faced a dilemma. Should they rebuild Babylon's walls using ancient techniques, or leave the outlines bare to speak for themselves? Some walls were rebuilt hastily with modern bricks. The result was Jaringa, ghost of the original, lacking texture, lacking soul. Critics called it a Disneyland version of history. Visitors wandered through, unsure of what was ancient and what was new. In the ancient bricks, many were left in storage, unnumbered. Others stayed buried. The voice of Babylon remained muffled, but perhaps that is the nature of certain ruins, not to be restored, but to be listened to more quietly. There is something poetic in that, something haunting. Not all ruins should be rebuilt. Some are best left in their unfinished sentence, and so the missing bricks become a symbol not just of physical loss, but of interpretive silence. What are we missing when we lose these bricks? We lose the names of temple architects who planned ziggurats with mathematical precision. We lose records of weather, crops, tax ledgers etched into fired clay and now erased. We lose poems, prayers, spells, complaints. We lose the smaller, less heroic histories, the footnotes of ancient life. And in that, we also lose a piece of ourselves, because the past, when intact, reminds us how fragile the present is. Babylon, its time, seemed permanent. Its walls seemed eternal. Its gods filled the heavens. And yet, 1,000 years later, a shepherd passed through the dust where its gates once stood and found only fragments. He turned a brick over in his hand. He didn't read the writing. He used it to weigh down his tent. Now, you sit with that image in your mind. The weight of a city reduced to a single stone, stamped, unread, forgotten, and you wonder not just what was lost, but what we're still losing, what walls built in. Our time will become mystery. What names will fade from our bricks? What stories will no longer be told? And as the wind brushes softly across the sand, you listen for the last words of a wall that no longer stands. It began with a chair, a simple wooden seat, worn smooth by use, tucked behind a row of marble benches in the Curia Juliata Senate House of ancient Rome. On most days, it was unremarkable, just another reserved seat in a chamber built for men who wore togas edged in purple and debated in the voice of law. But on one spring morning in the year 14 BCE, the chair sat empty. It was the second time that month, and this time, people noticed the senator's name was Gaius Septimius Ovidianus, a man whose name doesn't appear in many surviving Roman histories. Not because he wasn't important, but because, after that day, he simply vanished. No grave, no decree, no punishment, no honor. Only the saddened absence of a man who had once drafted laws with such detail that his colleagues nicknamed him Silentarius, the silencer, because he preferred to write policy in solitude rather than speak in the forum. Ovidianus was not a celebrity of the Senate, nor was he aligned with the loudest or most radical voices of his day, but he held a subtle kind of power. He was a jurisconsult, a legal mind behind many reforms that shaped Rome's civil laws in the years following the reign of Augustus, and yet, when he stopped appearing, no one filed a formal inquiry. A few whispered that he had retired to a villa near Capua. Others claimed he had accepted an imperial mission abroad. Still others said nothing at all because, in Rome, silence could be a kind of safety. But behind closed doors, a different theory flickered like candlelight in the minds of the cautious. That Gaius Septimius Ovidianus had written something he shouldn't have written. To understand why this mattered, you have to go back to the Senate's slow transformation. In the early Republic, the Senate had teeth. It wielded power over military commands, budget allocations, and the interpretation of law. But by the time of Augustus, and especially in the years following, the Senate had become more of a ceremonial body still, adorned in marble and tradition, but increasingly guided by imperial will. What mattered now was how laws were written, and Ovidius, it turns out, was a perfectionist. He belonged to a generation of legal minds, trying to standardize centuries of scattered statutes laws, written on wax tablets, carved on bronze, whispered in provincial courts, and debated by scholars. Sprawling as it was, needed consistency. And so, sometime in 15 BCE, Ovidius began drafting a new kind of code, lex ordinus, or the law of order. Unlike other laws that addressed single crimes or situations, lex ordinus attempted to define how all future laws should be evaluated. It was a meta-law law about law. His colleagues found it impressive. Dense, yes, but thoughtful. And then he added Section 11. Section 11 is the part that no one officially preserved, but fragments of it survived not in marble, scratched in the corners of wax tablets found in the ruins of a scribe's house in Pompeii. One line, in particular, has been partially reconstructed. No man, regardless of office or honor, may enact a statute that violates the reason of justice, nor suppress by power what is demanded by lawful speech. It sounds tame now, but in Roman Augustus's Rome, this was dangerous, because it could be interpreted, likely was interpreted, as a subtle critique of imperial authority, to suggest that no man, not even the emperor, stood above the law. That was a line too close to treason. There is no record of a trial, no Senate decree expelling Ovidius, no edict from Augustus naming him an enemy. Instead, Casta made stopped appearing. It vanished from attendant scrolls, from court records, from scheduled committee discussions. Casta stopped mentioning him even in correspondence. His house, in Rome, located modestly near the Aventine Hill, was reportedly sold to another senator by Winter. The seller's name is unknown, but here's the quiet part that only turned up centuries later, during a 19th century excavation of the Tiber's southern banks. Archaeologists discovered a wooden chest bound with corroded iron hinges, buried beneath layers of collapsed masonry near the site of an ancient granary. Inside were several rolled scrolls of vellum and papyrus badly water-damaged, mostly unreadable, but one scroll bore the name Ovidius at the top and beneath. In shaky, fading ink, a sentence preserved in full. If law is to remain the servant of order, and not of fear, then its author must be free to speak it. A sentence never read aloud in the Senate. A law never passed. A name that disappeared. What happened to Gaius Septimius Ovidius? Some believe he was exiled to the far provinces, perhaps to Numidia or Hispania, far from the capital. But there are no records in those territories of a magistrate by that name. Others suggest a quieter faith that he was ordered into internal exile, perhaps not killed, but watched, forbidden from speaking, forbidden from writing, a ghost in his own city. And yet, later Roman legal codes, echoes of his work survive. The Justinian Code, written centuries later, includes curious phrasing in its prologue about law, reason, and justice that scholars believe trace back to early formulations, like lex ordinus. No credit is given, but the fingerprints remain. You may be wondering, why does any of this matter? Why dwell on a senator no one remembers, and a law no one read? Because the disappearance of Ovidius isn't just about a man. It's about how power decides what history remembers. When a voice is erased, when a law is buried, when a chair is left empty, those are not just accidents of fate. They are choices. Someone, somewhere, decided that Ovidius should be forgotten, and that decision has lasted nearly 2,000 years. But now, in this moment, you remember him, his chair, scroll, his quiet resistance, and perhaps that is the beginning of unburying something, even if only in thought. The libraries of Rome were not built to last forever. The marble cracked, the scrolls rotted, the ash of forgotten wars and the soot of ordinary hearth fires smudged over more parchment than time could preserve. But for those who look not for names but for traces, a pattern can begin to form. A whisper encoded not in what is kept, but in what is missing. And so, as we move forward into the long shadow left by Gaius Septimius Ovidianus, we find ourselves not in a courtroom or a senate chamber, but in the corners of scriptoriums, where scribes copied laws line by line, and where a footnotes lashed out or paused might tell us more than a triumphal inscription ever could. Let's begin with a shelf dot. It sat in the tabularium, the official records office of ancient Rome, built high on the Capitoline Hill. From this vantage point, clerks could look out over the forum and watch the Senate's rituals unfold below. Inside, on carefully labeled wooden ledges, thousands of laws were kept in duplicate, one for enforcement and one for record. Among the shelves marked Lex was once a short-lived category, labeled Proposed Reforms. Year 739 Aber Candida. That year corresponds to 15 BCE. On that shelf, according to a record of inventories compiled in the 3rd century by the clerk Tertianus Maximus, there were 11 scrolls. When that same inventory was revisited under Emperor Hadrian, it listed only 10, and the only note beside the discrepancy was this: withdrawn, author, unrecorded. Order from prefect, unknown. In Roman terms, that's not unusual. Scrolls were lost. Orders were not always justified in writing. A key, but it's what came next in the Hadrianic inventory that hints at something stranger. A new shelf key label was created the following year. Commentary, temporals, temporary commentaries, and among those entries, a scribbled note from a junior scribe includes fragments from S.O., removed for lack of imperial sanction. S.O. scholars believe this refers to Septimius Ovidianus. The fragments weren't destroyed, but they were not preserved as law. Were demoted to commentary not binding, personal thoughts on the nature of justice and order. In Roman archival culture, that was a kind of exile, not physical, but intellectual, a silencing not of the man, but of his work. We travel now to another space, the Bibliotheca Palatina, a library annex near the Palatine Hill, where private collections from senatorial families were sometimes donated or copied into the public record. One scroll, donated by the family of the late jurist Marcus Tullius Stilo, contains a peculiar marginal note written decades after Ovidianus vanished. It reads, "Beware the lex that judges the judge." GSO asked, "Who shall keep the keepers?" His ink dried before the answer came. There's no proof this refers directly to Ovidianus, but the initials match, K, and the tone, veiled yet precise, suggests an insider speaking cautiously across time. By the late 1st century, this kind of whisper had become a ritual. Students of Roman law were told to read widely, but cite narrowly. Legal scholars passed down lessons through paraphrased fragments, careful not to name men whose memory had been administratively blurred. Ovidianus, it seems, became one of these blurred men. Let's pause here to understand how erasure worked in the Roman world. Contrary to the myth of relentless record-keeping, Rome was selective. It was skilled at two things: preserving greatness and forgetting threats. This forgetting wasn't always violent. 8. It was bureaucratic. The process was called damnatio memoriae, literally, the condemnation of memory. K. Ovidianus was never officially condemned. He was something more insidious, unremembered. There was no statue to topple, no decree to destroy. Instead, scrolls were misfiled, citations were left blank, writers used passive voice. The reform was withdrawn. Instead of naming who withdrew it or who wrote it, and yet these gaps left shadows. like the outline of a mosaic tile missing from the floor of a village's absence, draws the eye. Even in the famed digest of Roman law, compiled under Justinian, centuries later, a curious absence persists. A section on the nature of legal intention lists dozens of early jurists. But one entry simply says, certain reforms proposed in the age of Augustus were omitted due to concerns of propriety and tone. Tone, a word that hides more than it explains in trying to trace Ovidianus's final years. We turn now to personal correspondence letters written between minor officials. It's preserved not because they were important, but because they were reused as scrap paper in Egyptian tombs. Some were found in Oxyrhynchus, others in Elephantine. One such letter, from a low-level legal clerk named Lucius Rufus to his cousin in Alexandria, reads, ... Have you seen the manuscript from the Salentine areas? The one they copied without the crest. It speaks plainly of equality in statute, but such things are no longer requested, only tolerated. I keep a copy, but hidden beneath my licensure scroll. Hidden beneath another scroll, protected not by secrecy, but by boredom, in Rome. Sometimes the best way to preserve something was to make it uninteresting. Ovidianus's scrolls, stripped of official markings, may have survived precisely because no one considered them dangerous any more, just dusty thoughts from a man who disappeared. But what of the man himself? A gravestone near Beneventum bears the name Gaius Septimius, with no patronum or cognomen. The stone is rough, unadorned, with only a single line of inscription beneath the name. He listened more than he spoke. He wrote what others dared not. Say no date, no family marks, no profession. Could this be him? We'll never know for certain. The Roman world was full of Gaius Septimi, but this one, buried near the borderlands of the empire, with an epitaph carved in passive admiration, it aligns too well with the man we've followed so far. It suggests a life lived in the quiet margins, perhaps not destroyed, but redacted. What remains of Ovidianus today? Not much. A few fragments, a few overwritten scrolls, a few footnotes, no longer footnoted, but in a sense. That's the very heart of this story. History does not always erase with violence. Sometimes it covers with dust, and sometimes it is up to the patient reader, the nighttime listener, to brush that dust away. Gently, to notice the space where a law once sat, to feel the quiet weight of a man who believed too deeply in justice as a shared condition, not a tool of rule, and to ask, before drifting further into rest, what other names were buried, not by hatred, but by the calm machinery of forgetting. There is a law in every empire that is never written, not in ink, not on stone, but in the silences between proclamations, in the pause before a scribe lowers his pen, in the moment when a name is left out of the record, not struck, not erased, but simply omitted with the quiet precision of someone who knows what not to remember. This section is about that kind of law, and the man who brushed against it. We return now to the final traces of Gaius Septimius Ovidianus, not to resurrect his life, but to understand the mechanisms that swallowed it. Let's begin in Corduba, in Roman Hispania. There, in a villa partly excavated in the early 20th century, archaeologists found a room with a tiled floor bearing the faint remains of legal aphorisms, quotes, attributed to Roman jurists, ranged like a moral mosaic. One of them, partially damaged, reads, "Let law be made, not for the strong, but so the weak may stand beside them." G.S.O. This attribution does not appear in any surviving Roman legal compendium. It is not cited by Pliny nor by Elpian, and yet the initials, the tone, and the message fit precisely with the glimpses of Ovidianus we've uncovered. Even in far corners of the empire, his ideas seem to have traveled underground through student notes, scribe copies, even casual graffiti. They weren't always attached to his name, but the thoughts remained in another document. K. Parchment discovered in a provincial archive near Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon. A local magistrate writing around 98 CE voices concern about a legal petition that echoes ideas long prohibited by convention, if not by law. He mentions a commentarius vetus, an old commentary circulating among younger advocates, though the writer doesn't cite the document directly. One phrase stands out in the magistrate's warning. 2. Grant rights without requiring power is to invite chaos dressed as compassion. This critique feels personal, defensive, as though reacting not to a general principle, to a specific document that still had life in quiet corners of the empire. There are signs that Ovidius's legal proposals had been copied, shared, and even talked clandestinely long after he had disappeared from official memory. So what did he actually propose? It's difficult to reconstruct with certainty, but based on citations, marginalia, and legal paraphrases preserved in obscure treatises, scholars believe Ovidius argued for 3 radical ideas: that laws should apply equally to magistrates, and citizens, meaning governors, could be tried in local courts; that the Senate should publish all its legislative debates, not just final decrees; that certain civic duties, such as tax collection, should rotate among citizens by lot, not be auctioned to the wealthy. These may sound procedural, even dull, but in the Roman world, where power was wrapped in ritual, such suggestions were deeply subversive. They flattened hierarchy. They removed ambiguity. Potentially, they offered clarity where authority preferred shadows. Perhaps most provocative was Ovidius's unpublished scroll titled De Imperi Moderation, on the restraint of power. This scroll, according to later sources, argued that no man should wield unchecked legal authority for more than 1 year without renewal by vote, not even the princeps, the emperor himself. This was not treasonous in word, to have proposed limits, not rebellion, but in tone and in timing, was seen as an affront to Augustus's delicate balance between republican form and imperial control, and that, more than anything, may have led to Ovidius's quiet erasure. Let's return briefly to the man himself. Ovidius came from a modest senatorial family. His father had served as a quaestor in Sicily. His grandfather, it said, had once been fined for overextending grain rations during a famine. There were no monuments to the family name, only service, records, obedience, but Ovidius, educated in the tradition of Cicero and Cato, seems to have believed that justice had to be transparent to be legitimate. He spoke softly in the Senate, according to one late description, but when he spoke, people listened. His arguments were measured, dry, and precise, filled with references to outdated statutes, obscure precedents, and forgotten rulings. He was, the words of one later critic, a man who weaponized boredom to challenge power. That was his gift and his undoing. His disappearance was not theatrical. No trial, no exile stone, no assassination in the Forum. Instead, 1 year, his name appears frequently in Senate minutes. The next year, it is gone. His last known public act was to co-sponsor a bill requiring public declarations of income by tax contractors. The bill passed initial committee review. Then, without explanation, it was shelved 3 months later. Ovidius failed to appear at the Saturnalia Feastan event, mandatory for senators of standing. His seat was left unmarked. Centuries later, under the reign of Constantine, a copy of a legal digest compiled by students of an Alexandrian jurist includes this entry in a chapter on lost reforms. And let us recall, it's a soft voice, the law proposed by Septimius, which aimed to render the acts of rulers open to all men's review. The wind erased his words from marble. Some ink remains beneath our pens. This wasn't a resurrection, but it was a whisper across time. What does this tell us? That forgetting is rarely final, okay? that ideas don't vanish when names are removed. That silence itself, when it appears to precisely shaped, is often the product of hands deliberate, bureaucratic, careful hands. The law that Ovidianus tried to write, the one that never made it past draft form, was not buried beneath the earth. It was buried beneath caution, beneath time, beneath layers of polite omissions and reshuffled parchments. And yet, here we are, centuries later, talking about him, not because of what remains, but because of what doesn't. The blank space in the record. The missing citation. The half-attributed phrase on a villa floor. The marginal note in a forgotten copyist's hand. That is how some truths survive. Not in headlines, but in footnotes. Not in speeches, but in silences. So as you rest now, let your mind drift to that lost chamber of Roman law, dusty, echoing, filled with scrolls that never made it to statute. Imagine one parchment sitting slightly askew, no title, no crest, just ink slowly fading, letters curling with age, and, at the bottom, a final line before the scribe stopped writing. Let no man fear to be governed by law, and no law fear to be known by man, unratified, unsighted, but still here, waiting, quietly,